Hi, Vic. How you doing?
Rabbi, good morning. It's so good to see you.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we're still on the Sermon on the Mount, right? Like we haven't left there. Year 17.
Yes.
That's good. Okay, go for it.
The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 7, verse 1 onwards. Judge not that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is a log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye.
Okay, there's so much happening here, and I know we already did the first two verses, but as this is a section on the Sermon on the Mount about judging, and it also has parallels in Luke and Matthew and Mark, I thought it made sense to see it as a whole. And before we even go into depth what's talking about, do we understand what it's talking about? Like, do you understand what we mean by spec log? So I thought it makes sense to start there to just make sure. I feel like the English is hard because the Greek is a little hard. The Greek word for speck is karphos. Karphos technically doesn't mean a speck. It means something small or dry. And it probably means like a splinter. Well, let's not forget that. At least a lot of times we view Jesus as a carpenter. So therefore, let's imagine him in a workshop. I don't know what kind of, they had saws. So you can imagine dirt and splinters and woods all over his workshop and his life. So it would have been very normative to be able to have a parable that involves wood. So the way I understand this is that there's something in your eye. It could be a piece of sawdust. It could. I don't think it's a splinter. I don't think it's something that's stabbing you, because something stabbing you, that's already injury. This is something that is probably perceptible to you, or sorry, make it more clear, definitely perceptible to you, not obviously perceptible to another person, but possibly. And a log is just like the worst word over here. A log just means a bigger piece of wood. When I saw log, I thought it was like a math term, because I couldn't even imagine, the logs. I couldn't even imagine what a log, like what is a log in an eye? So that's like the worst translation. It just means like a bigger piece of wood. So, and again, I would even throw away the wood parable and just say something that is perceptible to other people. And I think this is a lot of times probably like the root of hypocrisy, right? Where you have something on yourself and it is perceptible to you. It's not something that's subconscious. It's not something that's invisible. You probably have one of those floaters or something in your eye or you have something like something blocked out and you're aware of it and you're kind of adjusting your life to make sure that you're not impacted, while another person has something literally almost identical, maybe a little bigger. That person clearly sees it as well. And you are like up in arms saying, I can't believe that this person has that thing, where you have a smaller version that's imperceptible to him, such that he can't bilaterally retaliate in a militant way for your militancy towards him. Okay, so that's what I think the parable is.
Yeah, Rabbi, you perfectly described me. You perfectly described.
that was my goal to. Isaac, I think you got something on your face right there.
So Rabbi, I had not connected log and spec to Jesus being a carpenter, right? So in that sense, yes, as a carpenter growing up in a shop which would these terms of log and spec make so much of sense. But if you take a step back, his audience were all mainly fishermen, right? Most of his disciples, they were all fishermen.
Who built their boats out of wood.
Yeah, but then being a fisherman is not being a carpenter, right? So part of me goes, if you were to be as a leader, you probably want to speak from the language of the masses, as in what stands out to them. So I'm intrigued by his choice of spec and wood. Now I can very well imagine that he can probably get to the same point by using some analogy of fish or something to do with this. It's some other way without it's just a thought.
It's so funny that you're focusing on the wood. So I do think the fisherman, we had the net story already, which we talked about how it's a super complicated net to make that you would definitely need carpentry skills. But for me, I didn't focus on the carpentry side or the wood, because it doesn't necessarily have to be wood. Every person has had junk go into their eyes at one time or another. If you're a fisherman, then you have water or wind, everything's bothering your eyes. So I think eyes is the most ubiquitous, most universal idea that he possibly could have chosen. So for me, I was actually focused on, is the eyes a deeper metaphor, or are the eyes just like everyone could understand that sometimes you're blinded? We've had multiple, think about it, eyes being blinded, eyes seeing, eyes lusting adulterously, all these things we've actually countered. And now that when you look at the Chumash, the Old Testament, it always says like, you know, to turn your eye away from something as a metaphor for saying like, you can't not see it. So it's both a literal sense, don't turn your head away, and also don't like not perceive things that are in front of you. So I think the eye, if anything, if you think of all the body parts that we have, eye is in the top 5 of things that we use metaphors for. So yeah.
So well, now that you mentioned about the eye, now this all makes sense. You know, he speaks of the eye quite a bit. So, what does the eye mean within Jewish theology, within at least within the Jewish way of life?
So
Is
again,
the eye is
it's
the
not
eye
again,
something
like,
more special?
I have one story about an eye, which I'm going to tell you right now, but I would say like it's not a Jewish thing, right? If you go to the Hindu tradition, there's
Mm-hmm.
no end of parables around the eye. If you go to the Buddhist tradition, there's no end of parables around eye. So eye is just like the most universal thing, as that the only one of it's the sense that allows us to expand outside of ourself more than any of our other senses, right? It's the thing that incorporates data and allows us to interact with the world. But that being said, me saying that we shouldn't overly focus, let me give you an overly focused story. This story is from Taanit. That's a tractate in the Talmud. It's from page 24a. So I just thought you would find it interesting, and it kind of sets the stage for maybe an additional way to look at the eye. So the verse from the Bible that I mentioned from Numbers 15:24 says, "Then it will be if it shall be committed in error by the congregation, if the mistake is made, it being hidden from their eyes." So the verse says that there's some mistake made in their legalistic tradition, or they acted wrongly. This verse indicates that leaders are considered the eyes of the congregation. There's a parable that illustrates this, involving a bride who is in her father's home and has not yet been seen by her bridegroom. As long as her eyes are beautiful, her body need not be examined. You know that if her eyes are in check, physically, then she's in check, and she's certainly beautiful. However, if her eyes are terutot, which means either teary or messed up in some way, let's just say that, her entire body requires this examination. So too, if the leaders of the generation are flawed, it is a sign that the entire generation is unworthy. So the eye in this situation is endemic of the beauty of the person. And if that one trait is okay, then you know that they're okay. And because the leaders are like the eyes of the generation, this Rabbi Oshaya, he was saying that the leaders of the generation are their eyes, and they will be like the barometer of the spiritual health of the people. If the leaders are flawed, then they're not. So I thought then if the leaders are flawed, then the people are flawed. I thought it's interesting how the eye is used to designate the spiritual health. And I think that very much falls in line with our New Testament attitude about Jesus, that what are you looking at? What are you doing with your eyes? Should you, I actually saw yesterday a meme. This is actually interesting. I think I saw this on Twitter, where someone said that it was a person who was advocating something about feminism. She's saying, I love about Jesus that instead of telling women to get more heavily dressed, to me more a sniut, as we say in Judaism, he said like men should blot out their eyes. So there's two attitudes. A lot of times in our society, in a victim blaming society, you'll be like, the victim shouldn't have been there or shouldn't have addressed this. So Jesus is like, don't worry about the victim, start stabbing. So I thought that was a meme I saw. So I thought that was a really interesting from the attitude. Like you see, the of all the body parts, probably the eye is the one that we talk on those. And you think about like, we don't want to skip 20 chapters ahead, but one of the things that obviously suffers in the end is also the eyes.
Suffers in the end is the eye. What do you mean
I'm
suffers?
saying like Jesus, part of his suffering, the physical body, the way it suffers.
Okay.
So usually we go for dot, line for line. I thought for the rest of our session, the most interesting thing to do would be to transition to talk about the philosophy, and I would call it the theology of this situation. Talk the theology of what we say in Hebrew, mida keneged mida, measure for measure. So you might, when we look at verse 2 and we see the idea for With judgment, you will be judged, and with measure, you will be measured. So in English, it's not like a good phrase. You'll be measured doesn't mean on a scale, doesn't mean that you'll be judged. So in Hebrew, the actual phrase for the theology of God doing tit for tat, you being punished tit for tat, the phrase is mida keneged mida, measure for measure. So what I would like to do now is to, as we've done in the past, to give somewhat about the rabbinic context of the theology of mida keneged mida, measure for measure, to try to place Jesus in his rabbinic context and maybe to be able to differentiate him from the rabbis of the time. And while we usually have one or two texts, I thought it'd be fun to have like one extended long text and maybe 4 or 5 additional texts. So this is going to be our most Jewish text-ridden discussion. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, in a way, right? There's this thing of measure for measure. This builds on some of our earlier conversation where what goes around comes around. Where he speaks of, again, seek ye for kingdom again. So as you do unto others, or don't worry about all these things. These will happen. A sense of causality, or a sense of what goes around, what you do comes back to you in a different way. It sounds like this builds upon that, but in a different way, or it's more nuanced.
Right. So what we're going to try to do is try to understand. I think we'll come up with more than one opinion, but probably 3, about what it means to be mida keneged mida, measure for measure. So first, I'm going to read you a very extended, long rabbinic text. This is in the Mishnah that was written by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and it's very weird in a Mishnah to have extended, long conversations that go and talk about verses and analyze things. That's not how the Mishnah is written laconically. It's written tersely, and this is a total anomaly. So I'm going to read it to you. I'll actually skip the Hebrew because that way we won't waste some time. But this is from Mishnah Sotah. Sotah is the woman who is tested with bitter waters for when she's accused of acting licentiously or illicitly against her husband. So this is the context in the first chapter of the 7th Mishnah. The measure that a person uses is used for him. What does that mean? God punishes or rewards a person in some manner that reflects his behavior. So she, the Sotah, made herself look beautiful for purposes of sin, to cheat on her husband. So too, the Almighty God makes her look ugly by commanding her that she uncover her hair. One of the verses in the Bible says she has to uncover her hair, she has to untie her hair, her clothing has to be torn. She exposed herself for the purpose of sin. So the Almighty exposes her by having her stand by, according to the Mishnah, by the Nicanor gate, which is in the temple, and showing her disgrace. So first we're saying that she acted one way, and therefore God commanded that she's treated this way. So it's going to be one of our values. She started the sin with her thigh, with her inner thigh, and then continued with her belly. So too, the verse says that if she drinks the bitter water, she will die by having her inner thigh as well as her belly distend, and she will not escape punishment. So first of all, we have 3 cases of the Sotah that she's punished, 2 by placing her in a situation prescribed by God, and 1 by a magical rite that physically punishes her because of the 3 things that she did. Okay, good so far? So again, this is almost like story-like. It almost feels magical, very out of feel for the regular Mishnah. So that's the end of the first Mishnah. And the next one, 1:8 starts. Samson, the Shimshon, the famous Samson and the Philistines. Samson followed his eyes when he chased after Delilah and he chased after other beautiful women. Therefore, the Philistines gouged out his eyes. And the verse says the Philistines grabbed him and gouged out his eyes. That's very famous ending. So because he followed his eyes, therefore he gouged. So this is also really great. We have an eye, it's not even a metaphor, but we have an eye example. Okay, and the Mishnah continues. Avshalom, who was King David's son, was proud of his long hair. So this is just now we have first we had the sin of licentiousness. We see if all deadly sins are here. The sin of licentiousness. Now we have the sin of pride because he was so proud of his long hair. Therefore, before he was stabbed to death, he was suspended by his hair when his hair got stuck in the battle against his father when he's riding on a mule underneath the branches of the elm tree. His hair got stuck and entangled in the tree, and the mule went on, and he was stuck in the tree. So because he was proud of his hair led to his downfall. Now that's our next case. And then there's a second case of Avshalom. Because Avshalom lived with 10 concubines of his father, that means he had relations with the 10 concubines. Therefore, 10 spears were thrust into him. As the verse says, 10 soldiers, bearers of Yoav's armor, circled around him and struck him and killed him. So that's the second thing with Avshalom. Third thing, because he stole 3 three hearts. He deceived three people. He deceived the heart of his father. He deceived the heart of the court, and he deceived the heart of Israel. He like stole their hearts, like as we say in English. The verse says Absalom stole the hearts of them in Israel. Therefore, three spears were thrust into him. As the verse says, three darts in his hand and thrust into him, as it says in 18:14. So we have first we had three cases from Sotah. Then we have one case from Samson. Then we have three cases from Absalom of Mida, Keneged Mida, measure for measure. Let's go on. And the same is true for good. And this is what I think is so interesting. And this does exist in Luke, and we'll see how it parallels in the New Testament. But it finishes all the bad stuff. It's really been horrible stuff. You kill, you get killed. You cheat, you'll get cheated on. But now, thank God, it now finishes on a positive note. And the same is true for good. The reward is also reward for a reward. Miriam, the sister of Moses, waited for 1 hour for her baby brother Moses when he was in the basket by the river. She stood by the Nile River. As the verse said, his sister stood at a distance to know what was done with him in Exodus 2:4. Therefore, the entire nation of Israel, the Israelites, waited while they're in the desert for 7 days when she was suffering from tsaras, the skin affliction. As the verse says, and the nation did not travel until Miriam was brought in Numbers 12:15. So because Miriam waited at one point, therefore the nation waited. So this is by far the weakest R1, because she's not really waiting. She's kind of curious. Her brother is literally in the Nile. She wants to know what's going to happen to him. I don't know if she's really doing this to be a good person necessarily. But it says because she waited, even though we wouldn't call it waiting, the Israelites waited in Numbers for 7 days for her to be cured from her skin affliction. So that's the first good one and our weakest one. Joseph from the story of Joseph in Egypt, he married to bury his father Jacob, although none of his brothers were greater than him. As the verse says, Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up both chariots and horsemen in Genesis 50-7. So Joseph specifically buried Jacob. And then it says Joseph was rewarded in kind, for he was treated with greater honor than Joseph. How was Joseph rewarded for burying his father? Because Moses, when he took the Israelites out of Egypt on their way to the desert to Canaan, he took Joseph's bones, very famously. So because Joseph worried about the bones of his father, Moses worried about the bones of Joseph. But who worried about the bones of Moses? And it finishes the third case. Moses married to carry the bones of Joseph out of Egypt, although none of Israel was greater than him, naming like it was beneath him almost. Anyone should carry bones, but Moses and Joseph both took care of this in Exodus 13:19. And he too was rewarded in kind, for he was treated with greater honor than Moses. For who was treated with greater honor than Moses, and that none other than God attended to Moses, as the verse in Deuteronomy 34:6 says, and God buried him in Gai, in the valley. And they said this, that God attended him, not only regarding Moses, but here's the last beautiful line, but also regarding all the righteous. As said, your righteousness shall go before you, and the glory of Hashem shall gather you in. That God kind of takes care. In the case of Moses, God attended to his body and his soul. But in the case of other righteous people, God gathers in the soul while people bury them. So God's involved in every burial kind of finish. So the one thing I want us to note with this really extended story, or extended analysis of a lot of verses, is that number one, that there's both negative and positive. There's very much a focus. It's not only that God rewards and punishes for negative, but it's also positive. Number two, some of the things were prescribed by God, but not necessarily executed by God. Namely, you should place the woman by the Nicanor gate, which is in the temple, out next to where the entrance of the actual temple was, next to the Zara, I guess in between the two, and you uncover her hair and you pull out of her dress, and those things are specifically done as prescriptions of God. So the question I think we asked in the past is, if we look at this from, I guess, a Buddhist perspective and from a karma perspective, is this meant to be understood as karma, that the natural world is set up in order to punish the bad, punish the evildoers, and reward the good? So that's one version of karma. Or is it that it's that which you put in, you get out, and it's not necessarily something natural, it's more a psychological principle. So I have more rabbinic text, but I want to cut off and throw it out at you before we do a couple more.
That's a good question. So this is what we discussed last time, right? So I said, does reality have an ethical structure? And so to your point, is it psychological, is it natural? I don't know. And I think maybe it's a
Does nature
combination.
work this way, or does God work this way?
So I look at this as laws of physics, right? Physics has there are lots of physics in place, and that's a law, and this gravitational pull in a similar way in terms of analogy, right? So in a similar way, in the ethical realm, are there ethical not consequences, but ethical laws or ethical things in place. And so now again, it's not an apples to apples comparison. It's to get, it's to, like we all understand physical laws. In a similar way, are there ethical laws in place? And that's what Rabbi Sachs talks about this, where he talks about the ethical structure of reality. And so again, but it's hard to define because we can't, again, say this is where it gets into, is it psychological or is it more as in God ordained this? I don't
Well,
know.
at least in this rabbinic example, some of them were prescriptions, namely put the woman at the Nicanor gate. Some of them were natural, that Avshalom's hair got stuck. Some of them were divine miracles, miraculous, in that the woman's body, if she drinks this bitter waters, then it'll fall apart. And some of them were just divine interventions where God buries the bones of
Moses.
yeah. But some of them were psychological, where it's not clear why. Yeah, Yosef buried his father because his father, and Moses took out Joseph's bones from Egypt because that was a promise.
So even the thing of God buried Moses, isn't that more psychological? Like this is God as a different being, a different being. We talk about him
Well,
coming at him.
I would call that divine intervention, at least what the Bible says. Like no one knows where Moses was buried. God, he went up a mountain and he disappeared. So generally, in rabbinic tradition, we say he had the kiss of death, which means he just lie down, and then his soul, his life is taken from him. So generally, and then his body kind of like is buried or disappeared. That it wasn't just left there. So it's generally viewed, at least rabbinically, as a divine intervention. Super special. Okay.
I want to put this back to you. So what do you think? Is it psychological or is it God ordained, or how do you understand all this?
Well, I feel like before I even answer, so I think again, like number one, it starts with, do you like kind of believe in a magical way that the world works? Like if you don't believe that the world works this way, it doesn't matter what you think, right? But let me give you, at least from that text I just read you, there's many commentators commenting. Let me tell you two perspectives. So one perspective is that of Rambam and Drashos Haran, and it says that God treats a person this way so that he will realize that what happens to him is a reward or punishment from heaven, and not some random happening. So the goal of measure for measure is for a person to know himself that what happens to him is itself a reward and punishment. So it's actually what I would say not an intrinsic matter, it's a secondary matter, because it doesn't matter. You don't need measure for measure, but by doing measure for measure, a person understands that there's a reason that this happened, and this is part of the scheme of reward and punishment. So that is one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that when one person sees another person being punished measure for measure, he'll be moved to examine his own behavior. He goes, "Oh my God, that guy was prideful of his hair, Avshalom, and he got his hair stuff. Well, if that happens to him, just think of all the bad stuff's gonna happen to me." Or when Joseph buried Yaakov, and Joseph had this special burial, oh, that shows that it's so important that if I do good things. So it's meant to almost be a lesson. The goal of measure for measure is not about the protagonist, the individual it's happening to. It's for society to be able to see and learn from it to act in good ways. So that would be a second version. So we have three opinions so far. So let's just review them. The first one is that it's divine intervention, or God set up the nature to work this way, or God works this way. That's 1A, 1B. The second one is that so people will know that this is how reward works. It's in order to make you aware. And the third one is in order to teach you that you should act this way. So what's interesting about all these is that I don't think any of those perspectives are the ones that we see that's happening in Jesus. But before we go back to the New Testament, let me give you I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you the most famous line from Ethics of Our Fathers 2:6. And I think it'll add to our conversation a little bit. And it's really interesting because I think in medieval manuscripts, this didn't even exist according to certain like Rashi and others. But so anyways, it says in Pirkei Avot in Ethics of Our Fathers 2:6, some guy, he saw a skull floating on the face of the water. he said to the skull, because we always talk to dead skulls, and because you drowned people, they drowned you. And in the end, they that drowned you will be drowned themselves. So this is a really, really famous example of measure for measure. And there's thousands of commentators write things on this because it's unclear what's happening. It almost creates this vicious circle that every single person has to be killed. Because if the next person who drowned you will be drowned, then the person who drowns them will have to be drowned, and we all have to become drowners. But I think it's really interesting that I think this is the most extreme version of measure for measure. It's saying because you did something, it could be that you will just naturally drown, but no, because you were a murderer. You have to be murdered in order to have mita. It has to be tit for tat, exactly like Absalom when he grew his hair. I think another way would have been like if they shaved his head, that would have been tit for tat, right? For him to be hanged by his hair from a tree, that's not exactly commensurate. Similarly, when Joseph buried his father Jacob, a tit for tat would be his sons bury him. Like it's the beauty of a father burying son. But what happened is that, at least according to rabbinic tradition, his bones were in the water in the Nile, and they had to rise them magically out of the water by Moses. And if anything, he didn't get a proper burial because once he was mummified, he understood he couldn't move his body to Canaan where he wanted to be buried, so he kind of put it in a holding pattern. The tit for tat, namely because I buried my father, therefore I will be buried, didn't take place. If anything, we see with all the good ones, namely that Joseph is buried by Moses buried by, each time it's actually a little bit better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rabbi, this reminds me of a favorite verse, the favorite Koheles, chapter 12, the last verse. The end of the matter, as all has been heard, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. And here's the last verse. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. And so when you say this thing about it, with all these good things, that it goes a step above, is it because that God's way of defining of his judgment with good takes on it's not at the human level, it's not at the human level. Would that be so? In some ways, do you see any connections between the philosophy or the theology of Koheles 12:14 and the examples you outlined with David and Moses and Joseph and Moses and Absalom?
You're definitely saying it from our first perspective, that one way to look at mita keneged mita, measure for measure, is just a divine scale. God makes sure to judge every iota that you do, and he makes sure that in this world there's a tit for tat, which is not obvious. You could just say God will completely reward you in the next world and call it a day. But apparently, like, because you judged, you must be judged. And if anything, it's very interesting because, like, at least from the New Testament perspective, it almost feels like a contradiction, right? Like, because you judge, someone else has to now judge you. So that person itself, it's very much like Pirkei Avot. It creates a cyclical problem.
Well, and probably this is where Christianity probably takes a different route, with Jesus and him being Christ, and and forgiveness and all the good things that come out of it. Yeah.
What's interesting is when you look at, put it in place. Oh, did my pencil fall out? Yeah, it did. When you look at Mark 4:24, just want to flip to that really quickly. It shows up a little bit different, but very similar. So Mark 4:24, when the purpose of parables, it says, let anyone of ears to hear listen. And he said to them, pay attention what you hear. The measure you give will be the measure you get. So if anything, this is almost like, not a threat. It's like, this is just the way reality works. But then, and still more will be given to you. So I think that is actually very much in line with our God keeps giving more and more and more, which I think is a much more positive note than we see in Matthew 7:1-5, because the idea of God being either God having two measures of the world, mercy and justice, and playing out in the way that it plays out in Mark 4:24 is probably not what's happening here, because this is more focused on hypocrisy, and the parable is more focused on making sure that you don't act this way. So for me, this feels more about not measure for measure, as Shakespeare would say, but more about threat. That you should realize that you can't act that way. And if anything, we always point out that Jesus loves name calling. And when we see in 7:5, you hypocrite, he actually very, very classically says out there, he throws out make it clear that this is something that you should know psychologically, it's not right to do, which is really, really interesting how this is focused on not the way the world works as much as making sure that you understand that you cannot act this way.
So in some ways, it sounds like he's taking Koheles, again, the last verse of Koheles, and then expanding upon that, as in, it's not as you said, it's not as in tit for tat, but this is not how the world works. As in, there are certain ways the world works, and one of this is there's this from some of judgment of good or bad or whatever this is, and so. Would that be one way of would that be one? That's what I'm hearing you say. So it's less about the tit for tat, and this is not how the world works. But it's less. It's more about here's how you shouldn't be doing. Here's how the world doesn't work.
Right. Yeah, I hear. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
So the more we learn, the more we read about Sermon on the Mount, all these themes from Koheles, they stand out. As in.
Well, Koheles's Ecclesiastes is probably one of the most philosophical, or at least negative philosophical works of the 24 books of the Bible. So it's not surprising that there's a lot of parallels. Okay, there's one more thing I just wanted to throw out before we finish in the last verse, where it says, "You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye." So I think also there's this really interesting prescription saying it's not that you shouldn't help or interfere in your neighbor's life. We see over here that there is an idea that you should interact or criticize or rebuke or point out the speck in his eye. But what you shouldn't do is do that before you first clear up your own situation. First, you have to remove the plank in your own eye before going on to remove that. So all that really does is take away the hypocrisy. So it's interesting. I think a lot of people say that you shouldn't judge other people based on this. But the beginning of the verse is don't judge, so you may not be judged. But over here, I would say there is a judgment here.
Mm-hmm.
And you are supposed to interact, rebuke, criticize, help, assist, vent, whatever. But it's just saying that you need to do a self-edit first. You have to first analyze where you are first, concern yourselves with yourself. But once you do that, if you want to go to the kingdom of heaven and take people with you, the way to do that, the way to proselytize is first focus on yourself, but then to proselytize. And I think that you see that right here. You'll see clearly to take once you do that, you'll know how to help the person better once you have that self introspection. And it's saying that you do want to interact, you do want to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye, but first you have to
take the speck out of your own eye.
Take the log, take the spirit of your own.
Interesting. No, thank you for highlighting that. I missed this part, but as you notice, as you've highlighted, it starts to do not judge, but then it ends with, you want to judge, but before you judge somebody else, first take the speck out of first take the log out of your own eye, and then you can take the speck out of somebody else's eye. So do you see connections between this essence? So the ending is more upon be introspective, take the log out of your eye. What connections do you see between this and
it's a surprise ending, right?
Surprise ending,
yeah. Because you would think he would just say, just shut up. Don't go and interact with people's specs. Let them be, work on yourself. So again, I think that from the beginning, do not judge lest you be judged. And the ending, like judge, but worry about yourself first. It's a surprise ending.
So in a way, right? So he's speaking against rugged individualism. Right? Don't just be focused upon you and your life. Part of this is, do you see this leading towards a form of communal living, or a form of is you focus upon communal living? There have to be some social bonds in place before one can So to help somebody else to take the speck out of somebody else's eye, there has to be some social bonds in place before that can happen. It cannot happen in a rugged
Well, I'm not
individualistic
sure. I don't think it's focused right now on the social aspects. It's really just saying, I think he's speaking, first of all, about himself. Yeah, Jesus is on the mount trying to say, this is the process that I went through of perfection to try to make myself better. And I want you all to go through the same process I went through to make myself as better, as holy, as much in the kingdom of heaven as possible. And then that's how you should be. It could be, let's be honest, it could be he means this rhetorically, that, because you never reached the place where you are completely obedient and completely rooted out sin, therefore you never can criticize. But I don't think that's what it means. I just think it means you first. And again, let's be honest, this is psychologically, when you're trying to help people, this is what we always say. If you want to be a good leader, or if you want to be a magnanimous personality that's able to influence others, you have to first work on yourself. I read that, just on a side note, I know we like talking about Rice Sachs. Rice Sachs is a phenomenal writer. So my wife noted for me once that he felt like over 10 years, he wrote every day a ton, and he felt that he was a horrible writer. And he only felt he's a good writer because he worked out so much. So I feel like, this is the attitude that you have to work on yourself. You have to grow. And then only then can you really be the influencer that you want to be, which is the opposite of how our social media works, right?
Yeah.
First, I'm an influencer.
Yeah. So on that note, I want to ask you one last question. So how central is Koheles or the book of Ecclesiastes to to at least back in Jesus' time into Jewish theology or to Jewish way of living? I know we have all the prophetic books. They speak of prophecy and this and that. That aside, but in terms of theology,
I mean, again, it's hard to answer that question. We can see in the Dead Sea Scroll community what books that they use. We know they use Psalms more, they use Isaiah more. So what we can do is we can see how often books are quoted. There's one verse from Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, that's cited all the time in the Mishnah: that which is twisted cannot be straightened, which is actually kind of blasphemous a little bit. I always feel like it kind of gets rid of the idea of repentance. But for the most part, I know in the first century they were debating if Kohelet, if Ecclesiastes should even be included in the Holy Canon. There was a strong opinion that it was blasphemous because of its ideology. So I think there's always been people. For me, the idea that Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, is part of the canon is so important because it shows a pluralism of thought. Because anyone who looks at Kohelet and feels that is the same theology as the rest of the Bible, I think is lying to themselves. Therefore, for me, who feels that the freedom of a theology and a philosophy, independent of it being top down, superimposed upon my thought, is so important. Kohelet is like the key that unlocks the shackles that allows you to have freedom of thought.
Rabbi, on that note, that'll be a great note to end, Rabbi. Amen, Rabbi. I like what you just said. No, amen. Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a great day.